Hello everybody. Obviously doing something a little bit different today. I thought it would be kind of fun to look at sort of the top 10 questions that I am most often asked when it comes to fairies. So I know I'm sort of new to the whole YouTube channel thing, but I have written a few books and I'm on social media and I have a blog. So I do actually get asked questions fairly often by people, and I thought it would be good and educational and interesting today to do a video and look specifically at the top 10 questions that I get asked the most often, because there definitely are questions that I get asked on a pretty regular basis. I'm going to do these sort of in the reverse order, that whole counting down from 10 to number 1 thing. Yeah, I'm obviously in sort of a silly mood today, so there you go. But hopefully this will all be interesting to people, and my thought here is that since these are the questions that I get asked the most often by people, these are probably questions that people watching these videos also have, or might find interesting. So, let's see if I can do this. Number 10, do fairies change or evolve? Yes, this is my very high-tech way of doing this, by the way. Not a super tech-savvy person. So, do fairies change or evolve? I do get asked this one, not super frequently, which is why it's number 10, but people do ask this. And basically the root of this question is, are fairies sort of stuck as we see them in the older folklore and stories, or do they modernize and update with human technology and human society? And I think we sort of see two answers to this. When we look at the folklore and the anecdotal material, we definitely do see fairies kind of keeping up with humans, as it were. Not in that sort of keeping up with the Joneses kind of way, but more in the sense that they seem to either mimic or follow whatever the local human society tends to be doing. So think of clothing, travel technology, housing, language, all of that. They usually are a generation or so behind, which we had touched on a bit in the video about what do fairies look like. So there does seem to be a little bit of a gap. But there definitely is at least the implication that fairies do change and evolve. They are not sort of stuck like flies in amber in any particular time period or way that we might view or perceive them. They adapt, they change as our world changes, they change as human culture changes. We could definitely get into a much longer discussion about why that might be, but we definitely do see evidence of it in the folklore. The other angle to this, of course, is anecdotal material, which we have right up until today, and that also does indicate that they change and adapt as human society changes and adapts. A couple particularly interesting aspects of this are the way that as modern American popular culture has changed the way that we're perceiving fairies, as fiction has had a very profound influence on how we picture them, how we understand them. People have begun to have interactions with them that then reflect these. In my book on recommended reading, I had mentioned Joshua Cutchin's book, The Trojan Feast, which connects fairy lore and UFOlogy, as well as some cryptid material. And that's another aspect of this where we see sort of this tie-in between modern perceptions of fairies, cryptids, and extraterrestrials, and sort of all these different layers of what we could consider modern folklore, all interlacing and interweaving. And that, to me, is another aspect of the way that fairies change and evolve based on human perceptions and human expectations. So I think we can definitely answer this question by saying yes, they do change and evolve. And that is something important to keep in mind as you're studying the subject, as you're reading about it, if you believe in these beings, if you're seeking to connect to them, which we'll get to in a later question, keep in mind that they're not just going to be the way they are in stories from 200 or 300 years ago, or this sort of romanticized, frozen in time, anachronistic view. They do change and adapt, and they do often reflect whatever the modern human culture of that place is, fairly close to it within maybe a few decades or a generation or two. So, that's answering question number 10. Let me see if I can get my very tech-savvy card for the next one. Question number 9. Do you really believe in fairies? I actually get asked this pretty often. Do I actually believe in fairies myself? Is my approach to them purely based in what I read? Do I think that they are something that exists in folklore but not in consensual reality? I can understand where people are coming from with this question, because I do reference the folklore and the recorded anecdotal material quite a bit. So I can understand that this could give people the perception that my entire basis for all of this just comes from books and what I'm reading. The answer to this, however, is yes. I do believe in them. I hate to say believe in them. I sort of take the Terry Pratchett approach to this, that I don't believe in them in the sense of that. I know that they exist the same way, to totally mangle a Terry Pratchett quote, the same way that I know that the postman exists, so I don't have to believe in him. But yes, I know that they're there, I know that they're real, I know that they exist. The whole reason that I got into studying fairy folklore and fairy material was because of my own personal experiences and my own, I don't know how to explain it without making this a much longer video and story, but just to be as simple as possible, from the time I was a young child, I had perceptions and experiences relating to the good people. So that sort of led me to seek out the folklore and related beliefs as a way to give myself a framework for what I was seeing and experiencing. Now, I can kind of understand why people wonder then, why don't I frame most of my writing and these videos based on my own personal experiences. There's a couple reasons for that. It's too easy, and I see too often where people just base everything they talk about and write about on their own personal experiences, and I think that can be very misleading. It's easy to look at just what one person experiences and what one person does and generalize that out as if it applies to everyone, and that often is not the case. And the other reason is really that the bulk of the folklore material, the bulk of the cultural material that exists relating to fairies is super important. It exists for a reason. It's existed and been passed on for hundreds, if not thousands of years for a reason. It provides a very important structure for understanding and relating to these beings, for protecting yourself from them, interacting safely with them. And I think that's something that everyone needs to appreciate and connect to, whether or not you do see them and interact with them yourself. So I try to frame everything in that wider sense of the folklore. I also have a lot of concern that the traditional beliefs and the traditional folklore are being lost. We live in sort of this digital media age where a lot of the older material and a lot of the older beliefs are not being passed on, and as the people who believe them, as the people who grew up with them, are themselves passing on, what they believed and what they practiced and what they grew up with is not surviving past them. That's one of the reasons that I really emphasize the value of Michael Fortune's work, because he is preserving in a digital format those beliefs and stories. and that's really invaluable. Those are things that need to be carried forward. So yes, I could talk more about my personal experiences and my personal take on things, but I don't think that my voice really needs to be out there, needs to be added, so much as the older traditional material needs to be preserved and carried forward, if that makes sense to everyone. But yes, for the record, I do believe in them, I do see and experience them myself, and that's what sort of led me to have this vocation, if you will. That's a very short version of that answer. But moving on to number 8. What was your most profound experience? This does kind of build off the last question, but for people who know that I do have experiences and interactions with fairies, I often get asked what was or is my most moving or profound experience. Now, it's important to understand when it comes to the fair folk that there are quite a lot of prohibitions or taboos with interacting with them and with dealing with them. One of which has to do with how much or how little you can or can't say publicly. So there's certain things that I'm just not comfortable really talking about too much, but I will share this one because I've already shared it publicly, so might as well continue. This happened in Iceland last September while I was there visiting on a trip, and I had become very ill one day. Everyone else on the trip had continued on for the events that particular day, had gone out, I believe, to Akureyri, to the city near where we were staying. I had stayed back because I was not feeling well. And that particular night, I woke up around, I believe it was 2 or 3 in the morning, and I distinctly saw 3 different figures standing around my bed. Normally, for the record, I do not encourage people to have a passive reaction to this sort of thing. If you wake up in the middle of the night when you don't feel well and there's 3 dark figures around your bed, panic is usually a good response here. But at the time, because I was very ill, and there also, in the moment, was not any sort of sense of threat or danger, I kind of just looked up and saw that they were there, and was kind of like, okay, well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen, and there's nothing I can do about it. And then I went back to sleep. And when I woke up in the morning, I was not sick anymore. I was fine. So I consider this a very profound experience for a few reasons. Firstly, because, I feel like I was healed in this experience, which is pretty profound. And also because just in that moment, sort of all of my natural responses and reactions, which would normally have been to panic and be upset, were not there. It was not a dream, for the record. I was actually awake. I did really wake up. I remember noting several distinctly physical things that were going on at the time in the room, including my roommate snoring. It was definitely something that did happen, as far as I'm concerned, and it was a very moving sort of experience, as strange as that sounds, considering that I realized in the moment my response was sort of like, there's nothing to be done about it, so I'm going back to sleep. And I was very grateful when I woke up that this had happened and that I had been healed by whatever, I believe it was the Alfar, but whatever powers had chosen to show up and do that for me. I am leaving out a tiny bit of backstory here. It was slightly more involved during the day than what happened, but and then I in the morning I made an offering out of gratitude. So I consider that one of the more profound experiences that has happened. That whole trip to Iceland had quite a lot of stuff going on. But that sort of stands out in my mind as one of the more intense and profound things that I've personally experienced relating to the good people. In that case, the Huldufolk in Iceland, but sort of putting them all in the same category here. Another clearly related question, number 7. What's your scariest experience? It's a fair question. I've had quite a few experiences with the good people that I would categorize as frightening. Genuinely frightening, by the way, not just like this is slightly unnerving or I'm a little bit scared here, but like really, truly terrifying, scary. Probably the one that stands out the most, and this is one that I had shared on social media when it happened, was an encounter I had with the Sluishi. The Sluishi, the fairy host. They do occur mostly in Ireland. That's where you hear the main stories about them. Obviously, I live in America, but I truly believe that was what happened on this particular day. That was what I encountered. I was leaving my house with my children. I have 3 children. And as I was walking out the door, I was standing in the doorway. My children had gone out in front of me, so they were a bit ahead of me in the yard heading towards the car. And there was a whirlwind of leaves that came by, and it was distinctly in a shape of a whirlwind. And I remember feeling very frightened just at that. And then, because I do see things, I saw a horse and a rider at the end of the drive, and I heard horses and hounds and bells, which is sort of a signature thing with the slua. And I remember thinking very clearly that my children were between me and them, and that this could be a very, very bad thing. And the one rider that I could see was looking right at me, with my children between us, and I was sitting right in the doorway. And a big thing with the Fae folk often is that you're never supposed to acknowledge when you can see them. It's not even like a prohibition or a taboo, it's just sort of beyond that, like super basic etiquette. You're not supposed to let them know that you can see them or when you see them. And it was just the situation and the speed that it happened in. I sort of locked eyes with him before I even realized I was doing it, and it was clear that he knew that I could see him. And I was just completely terrified. I really thought that this was not going to end well, and my children were in the middle of it. So that was a really, really terrifying experience. Luckily for me, for whatever reason, they just passed on and continued. I ended up making a lot of offerings very quickly, cream and honey and fresh water, and I think cakes. I think I had like little muffins, putting those out and just sort of blessing them and asking that they any harm be averted. But that was really, really terrifying. And I found out later that about 15 minutes, I think it was, after I'd seen them, across town from where I live, about 5 miles, as the crow flies, or as the fairy host flies, along a side road, inexplicably, 6 telephone poles were broken off at about, I think it was like 5 or 6 feet off the ground, and fell. And that's documented. I actually have the news article that was discussing it. They had no explanation for why it happened. They had tried to explain that there was some sort of microburst from a storm, had pressurized the telephone poles at a certain point. They never really could explain why it happened. Obviously, my thought is that that was the slua, that they had passed and they had knocked the telephone poles over, because they're known for causing random harm and malicious mischief, as it were. And that happened shortly after I saw them. So, and I have witnesses to this whole story. I am not making this up. because I had gone up on Facebook, I think it was, when I had first seen them, because I was that scared, and just made a comment to several of my friends who also know and believe in all of this. And then afterwards, when I found out about the telephone poles, I had shared about that. So there was this sort of real-time tracing of the events, as it were. But that was definitely one of the most frightening experiences I've had. At least partially because my children were involved in it, because that was not cool. So, future reference, if you're ever in a similar situation, don't let them know you can see them. Good advice there. I am often a really good warning of what not to do in these situations, because I usually end up doing this stupid thing. Number 6. Are fairies really dangerous? Well, now that I've told my Slowishy story, yeah, actually I get asked this question very often. Are fairies really dangerous? It's like asking, are animals really dangerous? I mean, obviously there are some that are not. Obviously there are some that are. And yes, I did say obviously. I mean, if you read any traditional folklore, it's very clear that there are some fairies that really their main interaction with human beings is to cause them harm. Kelpies and Ishasky water horses eat people, literally drag them into water and drown them and eat them. Red caps dye their hats with human blood. There's a whole range of types of fairy beings who are effectively just predatory towards humans. There's also some that are not. There are a variety that are, known to be helpful to humans, especially if the humans are conciliatory or kind towards the fae beings. So it's not a simple yes or no necessarily, but we do need to keep in mind that they can be dangerous and that certain types of them pretty much are always dangerous. Not Kelpies, by the way. Kelpie lore is very complex and can kind of fall on either side of that. But Ishasky and red caps definitely sort of fall into the always dangerous category. Hags are another one. Drown children and eat them, for example. So, just be aware that it's like everything else with fairies, it's complicated, but some of them definitely are potentially dangerous, and we need to not sort of get sucked into the mindset that all of them are super safe and helpful, because that does a disservice to the traditional folklore and beliefs, and also just ignores wide swaths of it. So I do realize, by the way, that there's sort of this whole modern line of thought that all of the depictions of fairies as dangerous are just some sort of weird propaganda, or were just created by Christians to make fairies look bad so that people wouldn't want to connect to and work with them. Let's be honest here. That's kind of the same line of thought of people who work, I shouldn't even say work, people who really like wolves, who try to argue that, wolves are basically just big, fluffy pillows that are totally harmless and loving. They're wolves. The reputation wolves have is built a lot on fear and negative propaganda. That's true. But they do still, kill and eat other animals. They are predatory animals. You can't ignore that and discount it. It's in their nature to be that way. And I think the idea that all fairies are just helpful spirits is really ignoring who and what fairies are. Even if we look outside of the Celtic cultures and look at other cultures that have not been heavily impacted by Christianity, if you look at, say, Buddhism and their spiritual beliefs and their beliefs with beings that are very similar to what we in Western cultures might call fairies, if you look at similar beliefs in Japanese or Chinese culture with beings who, again, are roughly cognate with what we would call fairies. in any other culture that has existed up until this point, really with minimal Christian influence, you are always going to find dangerous beings as well as benevolent beings. Much like if you go out in the woods, you're going to find predatory animals and prey animals. It's just, this is how things work, effectively. So, yes, some of them are helpful in their ways, and some of them are not going to harm you, and some of them will. So I don't think that's a matter of any particular, cultural or religious propaganda seeping into the belief system. That just seems to be, if you look, globally at beliefs relating to non-human spirits and otherworldly spirits, how they are understood. So, that's my opinion on that. Number 5. If they are dangerous, why do we connect to them? I get this question all the time. Not always from people asking question number 6, but I get this question all the time because I do write quite a lot about the more dangerous fairy beings. I do that. I write about them and I talk about them in particular because I think we need a balance with the bulk of material in American culture and American pagan culture, which tends to emphasize fairies in that more Victorian, New Age, sort of spiritualist viewpoint that places them as these wonderful, helpful guide sort of spirits, nature spirits, that are harmless and that are very different from the traditional folklore. So part of what I've been doing over the years to counter that is to put a lot of emphasis on the more dangerous ones and on the more dangerous folklore, to sort of emphasize to people that caution is needed and that some of them are dangerous. So I get a lot of people asking me, if they are dangerous, then why would we ever want to have anything to do with these beings? It's a legitimate question. The answer, though, is that, first of all, for some people, you really don't have a choice. In my case, I never chose to see them or connect to them or experience them. That was just something that always happened for me. So it's almost a bit of self-defense to learn about them and understand and know how to interact safely and protect yourself when you need to. There's also, a line of spirituality, witchcraft and paganism, that intentionally sort of sets out to build bridges, if you will, to work magic that involves connecting to the other world and to different spirits. If you are going to do that, then you do need to have a really solid grounding and understanding of what these beings are and how they operate and how to interact with them safely. And of course, there's also just the fact that, the traditional beliefs and practices and cultures need to be preserved and need to be carried forward. And a lot of the traditional approach to these beings was to acknowledge that they were there, to give them their due, to be protected against any harm or mischief they might cause, and to just effectively sort of live in an equilibrium with them. Not to necessarily really reach out and connect to them or work with them or have a relationship with them, but to be aware of them and to maintain the sort of healthy balance with them, where you are connected enough that you are safe from them, from any of their interference, but you weren't actively really inviting them in. So that's another reason to learn about them and to be aware of them. I think a lot of people who watch these videos are probably going to fall more into that second category maybe, but I don't know. And of course you might just be curious. You can learn all about this and not do anything with it except have the knowledge, which is perfectly fine. So, when it comes down to it, I think learning about it is valuable just so that you know about it. You don't necessarily have to run out and try to start actively engaging with these beings, because that can be interesting for your life. But if you are going to do it, you definitely need to be aware of exactly what you're dealing with and how to do that safely. The same thing as if you were going to go swim with sharks. again, a being that has a lot of propaganda against it and a lot of negative reputation, but which can be dangerous and which does kill people sometimes, not usually intentionally, but it happens. And so if you were going to engage in that activity, you need to know how to do that safely. And, from my perspective, that's the same reason when we are engaging and dealing with fairies that we need to understand what they can and can't do and what their folklore says about them, and basically everything that I talk about in these videos. So, number 4, is fill in the blank a good resource? How do I tell if a source is good? This, by the way, is the advantage of being profoundly dyslexic, is I can read things really easily backwards. So even learning disabilities sometimes come in handy. I get asked this all the time. Usually it's about a specific book or author. People will message me or contact me and ask, is so-and-so a good reference? Is this a good book? And so on. I do have very strong opinions, in case you hadn't realized that already. I do have very strong opinions. So sometimes I will just flat out say, yes, that's excellent, or no, that's rubbish, get rid of it. A lot of times I try to take more of a middle road when I can. I made a whole video already about what I consider some good resources that I highly recommend. But ultimately, I think you just need to be equipped to figure out if something is a good source on your own. So, really, critical thinking and discernment come in super handy here. Just, be aware that if a book is mostly relying on really dated sources that aren't just anecdotal material. If something is referencing a lot of anecdotal material from the 1800s or 1900s, that's fine. If something is referencing ballad material, a lot of which was collected in the 19th century, that's fine. But if something is relying a lot on the so-called academic material from the Victorian period, that is, authors who had a lot of opinions, if they're relying on scholarship from that period, that's really problematic. If you're reading authors who themselves are not part of the living traditional cultures and whose sources are really not part of the living traditional cultures, that becomes really problematic. If you are reading authors or looking at authors who are mostly just writing their own opinions, that can often be really problematic. One of the first things that I do when I get a book is go right to the bibliography and look at what books are being referenced, because that can tell you a lot about whether a source is good or not. If a book in any way is misrepresenting itself, if it's advertising itself as nonfiction and it actually is fiction, that's a huge problem. If it's saying that it's based off of some super secret text or manuscript that no one else has ever seen or that hasn't been in a museum, that's a big red flag. There's several books out there in the pagan publishing world like that, just run away. If books, when you look at the bibliography, are mostly referencing other modern neo-pagan books, that's a big problem. And I'm not criticizing modern neo-pagan authors, I am one, but when you're relying on other people who are basically writing their own opinions, or potentially themselves relying on faulty scholarship, that's problematic, and that's where we see this sort of continuation of inaccurate or bad material. So those are all things that I kind of put out there for things to avoid. If you're looking at material that's from academic presses, that's usually a good sign. If you're looking at material that was peer-reviewed, that's usually a good sign. If it's anecdotal material, stuff that was collected stories from people in the traditional cultures, that's always good. If it is put out there as collected stories, look at who's doing the collecting. Be aware that every author has a bias. Some authors will admit upfront what their bias is. I, for example, am pretty upfront about the fact that I take a very nativist view of Irish mythology, which means that I do believe the written Irish mythology, even though it was written down in the later Christian period, does contain genuine Irish pagan beliefs. I fully admit that I have that bias. Everybody has biases. Every author has a bias. Every YouTuber has a bias. It's just human nature that we are biased in favor of certain things. I'm biased when I write because I do believe that fairies exist, and that people who talk about and share anecdotal material genuinely experience things. That is a bias. I admit that. You will also run across scholars and academics who are very obviously biased against fairies as a thing, being that exists in reality. And so their work is sort of predicated on the idea that these beings do not exist, and it goes forward from there. That is a bias. You need to be aware of that. So these are all things that you just need to keep in mind when you're looking at sources and resources. I think I'll leave that there. Just my suggestions for deciding if a source is good or not. I could probably keep going, but I don't want to get too much into specific titles or specific authors. I already made one book recommendation video. I'll just leave it at that. And it is always good, if you can, to go to whatever specific culture you're looking at and look at material directly from that culture. That's often your best bet. So, question number 3. Can we see Celtic culture fairies outside Europe? I get this one all the time. I've actually taught workshops just on this subject, 2-hour workshops, so I'm going to try to fit this answer into like 5 minutes. Very, very bluntly, yes, we do see Celtic culture fairies outside of Europe and outside specifically of Celtic speaking countries. We have people from the diaspora in Australia and Canada and America who emigrated, who left Ireland or Scotland or Wales or any of the Celtic nations, and then would talk about seeing or experiencing different fairy beings from their homelands. It's my personal belief that when you have fairy beings who are connected to a population, because it's this symbiotic connection where we give things to them and they are connected to us in various ways, when that population shifts and moves, some of those fairy beings move with the population. So that's like the super short Cliff Notes version of that answer. Fairy populations, much like human populations, do shift and move around, if that makes sense to everyone. They are not all tied to one place, which is different from land spirits and nature spirits, who are really tied and location specific. But we do know, even just from the folklore, that fairies are not, that they are able to move and travel between different locations. And we have anecdotal references to people seeing and experiencing them in new places after they've moved, after the humans have moved. So that is the really super short version of that answer. Number 2, how do I start connecting to fairies? This is definitely the second most common thing I get asked by people who are interested in fairies and who want to know, since they're interested in this, how do they start actually forming relationships or connections to these beings? My answer is always pretty much the same. Start with the beings and spirits that are in your own home. Wherever you live, whether it's an apartment, whether it's a rented house, whether it's a condo, whether it's out in the middle of the country, whether it's in the city, doesn't matter. Wherever you live, There will be fairy beings, there will be spirits in that place. And the thing to remember is just that you always want to start with whatever's going to be most inclined to be benevolent and helpful to you. And that generally means house spirits, house fairies, beings that are already sort of inclined to be living around you. So good ways to do this: start making offerings, create a little space, specifically sort of set aside for that fairy being or spirit. Really just acknowledging that you know that it's there and that you appreciate it being there, and that you're willing to put some effort into connecting to it is usually a good first step. It's usually thought that house spirits and house fairies can communicate with people in a variety of ways. So if you start reaching out, generally they will start reaching back one way or another. And that's sort of the first step in connecting to these beings. So that's what I recommend in how to actually get started. Once you get started, there's a lot of different directions to go from there. But that is how I answer question number 2. How do you begin with connecting? Connect with what's immediately around you in your home. It sounds pretty straightforward. It often is going to take a little bit of time, but it's worth the time and the effort, in my opinion. Now, the number one question that I get asked more often than any other question. We'll see if this surprises you or if you expected this. Number one question: do fairies and humans make babies together? Yeah, no, seriously, this is the thing I get asked more often than anything else. It's also why the very first video I made was fairies and sex. Yes. We have a huge amount of folklore that tells us, in fact, humans and fairies can make babies. That's the answer to that question. Surprisingly, we have nothing about human and fairy birth control, so that one I can't answer. But in both Celtic material, in Norse material, and German material, we have a wide array of folklore about different types of fairy beings who connect with a human, male or female, and a child is produced. I want to be very clear here that we are talking about an actual physical, in our mortal realm child. Because I have seen some discussion in and around social media and the internet talking about non-physical babies. And that, I think, would probably be a completely different topic to discuss. But I want to be clear, what we're talking about here is actual physical, somebody gives birth to it in our mortal world, babies. We have a lot of folklore about this. Different types of fairies actually even have their own subset of folklore about reproducing with humans. I kind of laugh now when people talk about that humans and fairies hooking up is this sort of taboo, that would never happen, which I think has to do with the modern view of fairies kind of blurring them into angels and spirit guides, and that's a no-no with that. I don't know for sure, but when you look at folklore, oh no, that happens all the time. All the time. So we have Selkies. Selkies were often known to produce children with humans, not usually voluntarily. Selkie lore has a whole layer to it about the Selkie being taken unwillingly by a human fisherman as a wife and then having quite a lot of children with him. But these are half Selkie children then, who then go on to live in the human world and marry humans and then have more children. We see stories of Kelpies, I mentioned a little bit earlier. Yes, they do drown and eat people, but they are also known in Scottish lore sometimes to fall in love with human women. Sometimes that love is reciprocated, sometimes it is not, but children are produced between those unions, who again would be half human and half Kelpie then. Kelpies are shapeshifters. They can appear as horses or as human beings, human appearing. So it is possible for Kelpies and humans to have children in the folklore. There's an account in Grimm in Germany of an elf who passed into a home through a knothole in a door and became the wife of the man who was living there, gave him 4 children, and then inexplicably one day left. The 4 children remained and were raised, apparently perfectly normal seeming human children, despite the fact their mother was an elf, and went on to live their lives. We see similar accounts in some Norse folklore mythology of children who have a parent who's among the Alfar, who effectively is an elf. We have accounts in Ireland of different family lines who can trace their lineage back to members of the fair folk. So this is not something that is really uncommon in folklore and mythology. This is actually something that is super common in folklore and mythology. So, to answer the question, yes, in folklore it used to happen all the time. In modern anecdotes, people certainly don't talk about it anymore, so it would be harder to give an answer about does this still happen today. It used to happen all the time, so I'll sort of leave it up to the viewer to decide whether it has stopped or not. I do also want to clarify really quickly, because I see all these little quizzes and things that go around of like how to tell if you have fairy blood. Most of those are just silly. Really being drawn to nature, not a sign that you're a fairy. Inappropriate humor, not so much a sign that you're a fairy. Trying to think of some of the things I often see in these little quizzes. Basically, most of them are predicated on the idea of the modern, super Disney-fied, New Age view of fairies. When we look at the actual folklore and descriptions, the few descriptions that we have of children of these unions, they are generally described as seeming fairly human. Sometimes they were known to be unusually pale or somewhat odd-looking. Could not tell you what odd-looking means because the texts are often not super clear. They were sometimes described as being quite beautiful, but not always. So, I don't know. Children of unions with Selkies were specifically described as having webbed hands and feet and very dark hair and eyes. I told you that's sort of its own little subset of folklore. Generally speaking, children of these unions were also said to be very charismatic, to be known to be sort of uncanny, potentially have, magical powers, also occasionally be known to have a lot of wisdom, usually with the idea that they were taught things by their non-human parent, skills or abilities, that sort of thing. But there's often not a ton of physical characteristics that really make them stand out from other human beings. It's not like other humans see them and immediately say, oh, I think your mom was one of the Alfar. It just didn't really seem to work that way for the most part, although they did also seem to have something about them that people sort of clued in on that was unusual or different in some way. So it's a little hard to be certain looking at it, but all of these, like you're attuned to nature and you like the smell of flowers, or whatever these little quizzes things tend to say, that's not really accurate. You're not going to be able to figure out if you have fairy ancestry based on whether you really like flowers or, happy music. That's just not how that works. So, That is my number one most often asked question. I don't know if that surprised you. It used to surprise me. I've gotten used to it at this point. It's a topic that just endlessly fascinates people, I think. So, I know this video ran really long, but I did want to cover my top 10 most often asked questions. If you ever have any questions or anything specific you would like to see me do a video on, please feel free to ask in the comments and I will try to get to it. Have a good day.